Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be taking a look at setting up our analog temp inputs into our Motec M1 series box. Now in this particular tutorial, we're going to take a look at setting up a couple different types of temp sensor inputs to our Motec and discuss how we can use the drop-down menu in terms of the sensor selection for Motec, as well as taking a look at how to set up things manually in case we have a sensor that's not found in that drop-down menu. There can be some sticking points when you're trying to input the data from a data sheet for a temp sensor. So we're going to go take a look at that and use an Excel spreadsheet calculator to help us translate the ohm reading from a typical spreadsheet into a voltage reading that the Motec is going to be expecting. Let's jump in here and take a look at where we can find to configure our analog temp inputs. Now, if we first jump in here, and I'm going to be using my supplied workbook here, we're going to jump down into the setup, which is going to be our second option right here. And then we're going to move over here into basic inputs. Now under basic inputs, we can find a variety of different temperature sensor inputs that we might be using. First thing we see here is an airbox temperature sensor resource, and we're going to see here that it's not in use. So that's going to say that we're not using the airbox temp sensor resource, and we don't have anything wired into that particular channel. We're not going to be using that for anything in the Motec. However, if we take a look here in the next sensor configuration area, we have a coolant temp sensor resource. And we can find in this particular example, working on my engine simulator here, just to do a demonstration for the tutorial, I have my coolant temperature set here to the analog temp 1 input. We can see that right here. If we use our drop-down menu, we're going to find here that we have a lot of different options to choose for setting up our analog temp inputs. Now, looking here, we actually only have 6 available on my M150 box. So we have analog temp input 1 through 6. This is where we traditionally want to wire in and work with any analog temp inputs. So oil temperature, coolant temperature, inlet air temperature, this is going to be what we typically choose. The only situation you might find yourself in where you're not going to be choosing one of these options is if you're using your Motec in parallel to a factory ECU and you're sharing that temp sensor input with the factory ECU. So you might find, let's say you're in parallel, you're sharing the coolant and intake air temp sensors with the factory ECU as well as the Motec. In that situation, you would have to choose an analog voltage input. If we go up here, we can see we do have these options here for analog voltage inputs. The difference between our analog temp inputs and analog volt inputs is that the analog voltage input does not have a pull-up resistor built into the circuit. When we're selecting here analog temp input 1 through 6, we're finding that it has a 1K pull-up to 5 volt built within the circuit. So that's traditionally why, if we're not setting up our Motec in parallel to a factory ECU, and again, sharing the sensor signal between a factory ECU and the Motec, we're going to be choosing our analog temp sensor 1 through 6 here because those have that built-in pull-up circuit. When you're dealing with a parallel setup, you're going to find that the factory ECU is going to have that pull-up circuit built within the circuit, and you're not going to be able to have 2 pull-up circuits sharing the same sensor because it's going to cause the sensor to be completely skewed in terms of the sensor reading. So be mindful of that. Traditionally, what we're going to find in most engine harnesses is that you're just going to be wiring your Motec to all of your sensors, and you're not going to have anything set up in that parallel configuration. So we can see here my coolant temp sensor resource is set to my analog temp input 1. Now we can see here the coolant temp sensor calibration is set here to manual. In this case situation here, when we have a manual option, we're going to have the ability to go in and change our actual coolant temperature in scaling to volts. So we have to tell the Motec in that situation what volt from the sensor is going to equate to what temperature from the sensor. So it's going to be something we have to do in a lookup. When we choose this other option here, we see manual, we can go down here, we have other options. We're going to find that we have pre-configured sensor options here in our list or menu. What's nice about this, if we look here to the right, we're going to find that it's going to actually tell us what the specifics are for the choice of the sensor we have in our drop-down menu. We have a lot of different options here as we go down, a lot of OEM sensors as we're looking through this. So we do have quite a bit of options to choose from. There are also the ability to use a CAN addressed coolant temp sensor reading coming through a CAN network coming into the Motec. There might be a variety of reasons that you might have that coolant temp sensor set up on a CAN network. You could choose that in your CAN coding here, but in this situation, we're traditionally going to have that coolant temp sensor as something that we select through one of our options in here. So if we do have a sensor that's found in the sensor list, specifically part number and then the details on the sensor, if that matches the sensor you're using, you're just going to choose that out of your dropdown. If we have a situation where, in this case, we're not going to find the sensor in this sensor configuration list, that Motec has done the work for us, then we have to choose the manual option. Let's assume for this particular sensor that we're going to go in here and choose the Bosch sensor with this particular part number, and let's assume that's what we have installed. We can take a look here. Once we select the sensor and we take a look over here on the side, we can actually see what that coolant temp sensor is reading. Now, if your engine is cold, which it should be if you're configuring everything and you're live with your Motec at this point, because you're just building your base file and setting up all your inputs and outputs, you should be able to see that the coolant temp sensor matches or is very, very close to your ambient temperature. So in this case, 72 degrees Celsius is what we're finding the coolant temp sensor is reading. Doesn't seem accurate, but that's not the sensor that I have installed.
Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here, and you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.